Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by Ricardo Lupo, Head of Solutions Engineering at LogDNA. Ricardo is also one of our chapter leaders for our New York local chapter of PreSales Collective. The topic of today's episode is constructing an effective pre-sales team. While this topic can be very broad, Ricardo brings a very tactical perspective to today's episode. He talks about the core components of what it actually means to construct an effective pre-sales team and really how to maximize your employees and maximize the impact that they have on the organization. We also talk about a few things as relates to working with other departments within your organization and really how you build an effective pre-sales team. Enjoy. Today's episode is sponsored by Vidyard. With Vidyard, you can record and send custom video messages to your prospects and customers to stand out, clearly explain ideas, and connect on a more personal level. With Vidyard Pro, you can gain access to rich viewer analytics, customize your video playback experience, add your own call to actions after the video, and more. Sign up for Vidyard for free at www.vidyard.com. Once your account is active, select the upgrade option and use promo podcast PSC for a free 30-day trial of Vidyard Pro. Ricardo, welcome to the PreSales Podcast. How's it going today?
James, it's going great. Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be on this podcast with you.
It's my pleasure. Ricardo, we've gotten to know each other pretty well over the past few months as you're one of our leaders in the New York chapter. So it's great to have you on here. I know that we've talked many of times about a broad spectrum of topics around pre-sales. And so I'm definitely excited for today's episode. But before we go into it, we had an amazing event in New York City earlier August. So I just want to say thank you and the New York team for getting that together. I mean, it was unbelievable. I felt normal again.
Absolutely. The word normal probably has never resonated so much in my life than it did during that live event. I know with COVID and just being remote and hunkered down, and we all talk about Zoom fatigue being such a big thing, just the ability to be in person with people, to talk about pre-sales, to talk about people who have like-minded intentions and approaches and goals and thoughts was just amazing. And I met somebody just coming into the event that it's in my head now, and I have it written down, and I just continue to hold on to it as something that's important for pre-sales. I love that I can walk into a room and I don't need to spend 15 minutes explaining to somebody what I do. I think if that captures what we're all trying to do and what you've done and usually have done and Kevin is now doing and working with you all to elevate the role of pre-sales, I can't think of a better problem statement to solve for than that quote.
100%. And that quote has continued to resonate with me. It makes me feel like we have our people, our profession, and people who understand what we do on a day-to-day basis and what we go through. And it's just amazing to see the community safely come together. And I was really excited about that New York event. It's actually kind of nice living in Chicago. It's a lot easier to get to New York than San Francisco. So I think I'm going to be out to some more events soon. What do you think about that?
We'd welcome you with open arms. And if we could do it, we'd have an event every week. I think it's so impactful. It's so important to keep pre-sales front of mind. So James, we definitely look forward to continuing to work with you and UG on really elevating the role of pre-sales and driving community. Community is really important to me, but community in-person events and things like that to really drive that message forward.
As long as we can try different pizza places, that sounds good for me.
It's on me. I will definitely do that.
So let's talk about your pre-sales journey. What got you to where you are today, Ricardo?
So it's a great question, and it's probably one listening to the podcast. I can't count on my fingers now how many times people have said this, but I got into pre-sales by accident. I spent the first part of my career working in financial services, technology organizations. You're really just thinking about how we supported the business and things of that nature. And I just had an opportunity at some point, say about 12 years ago, where I had an opportunity to work in a pre-sales capacity, and I just got into it by accident. I can tell you right now, I wish the PreSales Collective had existed when I got into this, because I probably made every mistake in the book and then some multiple times. I can't tell you how many times it's been I should have known that, but there was no real reference point for me. And so really one of the things I've learned over my career and now in leadership as well is that making mistakes are okay, because they're always an opportunity to learn, right? We learn more from our failures and our mistakes than we do sometimes by our successes. One of the things I've held on to, though, is coming prepared, being prepared, and having intent. And so making the same mistakes is definitely not okay. And it's something that I try to lead by example on and really try to instill with my teams as well.
I appreciate you walking us through that. It's a very great point. I went through that light bulb moment early in my career where I thought everything was supposed to be perfect at all times. And then I realized it's okay to acknowledge that things aren't okay and that there needs to be improvement. organizations change over time. And that's our job as leaders to really be able to adapt. And Tristan Tal on a previous episode said, are we as leaders growing at the same rate as our companies? And I think that's really resonated with me as we think about our pre-sales journey. I want to dive into today's topic because it's a very interesting one. Topic of today's episode is constructing effective pre-sales teams. And Ricardo, we talked a bit about this topic a couple of times because I think it's fairly broad. And so I think we can go a number of different ways on what it actually means to construct an effective pre-sales team. To you, Ricardo, what does this topic mean?
There's really two main parts to what this topic means to me. And the first part really is around the awareness, the commitment around the work involved and approaching the actual construction of a pre-sales team and doing it with purpose, intent, and the willingness to do the work. To me, that is above everything else, like the tactics and the things you need to do, having that mindfulness and that intent and the awareness that there is actual work that needs to happen is critical, I think. And I think the second part of that is just having an understanding of where you are, your product, your go-to-market strategy at the time, really understanding how you're talking to potential customers, how you're talking to existing customers, understanding all those collective conversations and tidbits and nuance and what I'll say is more qualitative pieces of information. It's very easy to look at the quantitative. What's our win rate? How many demos are we doing? That's very important. What's more important here is distilling that nuance, those qualitative aspects of it to really figure out what's your mold, what's your fit that you need to really build on. Do you need strong technical chops? Is it a very heavy technical sale? Do you need more consultative SEs because you're having a challenge really distilling, tying the technology to some outcome for the business? And then all the while, I think wrapping around those two parts is really around ensuring that you can find coachability, aptitude, and the desire to learn and grow. Because I know we've talked about this, organizations change, strategies change. And so that adaptability, thinking about those things in the context of how you're building and leading teams is, I think, super critical.
Ricardo, I'm really glad that you acknowledged that things change and evolve, because I think so many times we want to approach building our pre-sales teams or building efficiencies with a one-size-fits-all mentality. I have become a firm believer in frameworks. You have to be able to take your framework and have a way that you're going to approach the situation, or maybe approach 60 to 70% of it. But you need that 30 to 40% for creativity and adaptability. And I think that is a critical component that you've mentioned, because there's so many times people work at very successful companies and they want to go to a smaller company and say, hey, we're just going to run the same playbook. And it doesn't work. You have to be able to find that fit. You mentioned a lot of really good things, but I want to get really tactical on this topic. What are the components of constructing an effective pre-sales team?
There are definitely a number of things that I have built and gotten value out of and that have really worked. I think the first thing that's super important is really having a prescriptive onboarding program, having a set of activities that there's accountability around week over week, that you drive towards basically ensuring success of the people you bring on. I say this all the time. It's always in the front of my mind. Pre-sales is the hardest resource to bring in, to enable, and to be effective. You think of a sales resource, playbooks, you have scripts, you have your checklist of things that you do. And while I'm not saying it's easy by any stretch of the imagination, it's also fairly static, I would say. Think of a pre-sales resources as you having to combine all these different things and all these different traits. How do you ensure their success? So having that prescriptive onboarding program is a must. And I'm not talking about the general HR people team onboarding new employees get, very critical for a new employee experience. I'm talking about detailed set of activities that your new hires need to do to be successful. And the way I kind of distill this, you just mentioned it before, right? Like this very nebulous, I want to bring on a great pre-sales person and then just the conversation stops. Think about someone who's aptitude and drive. If you start with those qualities, how do you make them an A player? We talk about I want A players. We need A players for the SE organization. But how do you know what an A player looks like for the business you're supporting? You need to be thinking as much about all the technical knowledge that may not exist in your docs page. I mean, back in the day when I got started, people talked about SE as being 60% being able to regurgitate the docs page. Well, docs back in the day were behind paywalls. Right now, docs are out in the open. So regurgitating docs pages is an important. What's that level deeper? How do you explain those things? How do you walk your audience through those? And then really the soft skills, they need to get to that level. Your ability to basically answer questions is very binary. And we know in pre-sales, it needs to be more than just yes, no. You need to be able to expand, have curiosity, and turn it back to your audience to actually get into the particulars of what's really driving them.
Ricardo, there's a lot of things that you said that have really resonated with me. I think it's really mission critical to find those things like aptitude and drive to be able to find effectiveness in your team. This actually has me thinking about my own experience. In terms of the components of the effective pre-sales team, does your approach differ if you are inheriting a team versus building one from the ground up?
I think the approach differs in terms of what your priorities might be. You having that foundation is super, super critical. If you think about, say, for example, inheriting a team, having a prescriptive onboarding may not be your first priority, but at some point it's going to be important for you to have, because the conversation we just had around organizations growing and changing, you run into the same problem that you have when you start building the organization, which is I need more of this person versus I need you to help scale the function. And I think it becomes very easy for people to react to saying I need to replicate a specific person versus looking at actually expanding the role, expanding what you need to do. And the onboarding piece I mentioned before, it's something that you iterate on. It's not something that you build once and you leave it for everyone to kind of reference in the past. So part of that other piece around building the onboarding is, as a leader, as somebody that's building this, you have to get your hands dirty. You have to be involved. It's very easy to go and have individual conversations with your individual stakeholders, get their sort of perspective. And one of the things I've learned in my career is when you do that, you end up hiring for lack of weakness. This person has no perceived weaknesses versus really trying to hone in on strengths and why those strengths are important for where you are as an organization. So I think, to your point, starting the team, having a foundation around building the team versus inheriting a team, onboarding is critical. The other thing onboarding does, it helps establish feedback. And so when you inherit a team, how do you instill the culture of feedback, especially now with remote first? We're not seeing each other on the regular. Zoom, Slack, these are asynchronous forms of communication, are just pervasive in how we operate. And as leaders, how do we make sure that we're instilling that culture of feedback? When the person starts in the organization, it's very easy to do that. Part of the onboarding is to have those regular one-on-ones, those check-ins, make feedback two-way. When you're inheriting an organization, people already have kind of an informed way in which they're doing things. And so, there's a bit of massaging your way in terms of, figuring out where everyone kind of stands in terms of aptitude and whatnot, but also almost being very clear and direct around how communication is going to happen. Also, as a leader, one-way communication is just not effective. This whole idea of task-oriented, top-down leadership just doesn't work in the industry these days. And so having that mindfulness of that, I think, is one of the most important parts of what you do in terms of the activities inheriting versus building a team.
Ricardo, you said so many things there that have gotten me really excited that I want to talk about. I love culture feedback. That is one of my favorite topics to talk about, because I really believe that that's how you build trust and you set expectations and you move the needle, not only for yourself as a team, but understanding where you have strengths and where you have weaknesses. And that's something that you talked about well. And I love that you said, I need more of this person. That happens so many times in early stage companies. I reflect back on myself. That's what I was looking for so many times. Todd Jansen has said it on the PreSales collective events before, is stop trying to hire unicorns. You have one person, they've done an amazing job. They've built a great reputation internally. And your job is to go and find other people that are just like that. But it's easier said than done. And most times than not, it doesn't actually happen. And talking about focusing on lack of weaknesses, I love the idea of leaning into the strengths and creating a diverse team and creating a team with different perspectives, in my opinion, is how you can get the furthest along as a group. I want to talk about hiring very specifically when we talk about effective pre-sales teams, because there are so many open roles out there with pre-sales. There's a real supply and demand issue. But so many times we think that we need to hire this profile. The profile is A, B, C, D, E. And when we look to those people, we sometimes are extending our hiring cycles. But a lot of times we actually have to work with our recruiting teams to try to find what exactly we're looking for and fill those gaps. And so I'm curious on your perspective on what things have you done to potentially change about how you're interacting with candidates, especially when you're working with recruiting teams that are maybe doing some of the sourcing for you early on in that cycle.
James, I think that's a super important part of this whole equation. You talked about what you do if you're taking on a team or inheriting a team versus having to build a team. One of the things I think is imperative wherever you are in that journey is to establish a relationship with your recruiting team ASAP. The idea there is that you already have sort of a fundamental understanding of where you want to be. You're going to learn, and I mentioned before, you do have to get your hands dirty around building that prescriptive onboarding, figuring out all the things you need to have your team be successful, whether, again, you're bringing them on fresh or you're inheriting. But establishing a relationship with recruiting is super important. Reviewing job descriptions. How are they actually communicating the role out into the wild? What does that process look like? If you have one, dig into it, write it all down, figure it all out, get their perspectives on what they think has worked or hasn't worked. I'm going to go back to the PreSales Collective, just the collateral, the things that are out there in terms of like defining what those soft skills are, what the signals are that recruiters should be keeping in mind are critical, and just be able to leverage that and to have those conversations just adds a level of credibility to your relationship with the recruiting teams, and really being mindful of things like years of experience. I think that's one of those hiring unicorn biases that we have to really start to think about divesting and not including anymore, because I think, first of all, it severely limits your pool of talent. And then secondly, I think it really removes the responsibility on you as a leader to make those people successful, because now you lean on years of experience to say, well, this person has 10 years of experience. Of course, they're going to know what to do. How do you know what they're going to do? They knew what to do the past 10 years of their career. Those aren't really indicators one way or another. They're just numbers. And so I talked a little bit before about qualitative versus quantitative. When you distill things qualitatively, you can then start to measure. But without those qualitative baselines, it's hard. So I think also thinking about what those job descriptions are, thinking about what type of message you're sending out to people who you are trying to recruit. And I think the last thing, the 3 R's, right? Recruit, retain, revenue. Part of the recruiting is showing people that you know what it's going to take to make them successful. It's your part of the contract that you're making with the person that you're potentially bringing on to show that, hey, you need to bring X, I'm going to bring Y, we're going to make this work together. And I think it just starts to build the foundation of a lot of things that we talked about in terms of feedback and whatnot and growing the team. I think those things are super important. And keeping a constant communication. Like if you know you're hiring, get weekly calls on the calendar. Go through it. When you get started, go through what you're thinking. Go through how you view the world. Check in with them. Show them what you build. Show them how you're thinking about the things. You're giving them the confidence to go out and say, okay, if I get this type of persona, I can bring them in, and I know we're going to have a high rate of probability to bring them on and make them successful.
Ricardo, one of the things that you just mentioned about years of experience is so interesting. Michael Watkins in the book, The First 90, talks about what you've done before you get a job will not make you successful in that next role. And when you talk about years of experience and someone being there for 10 years and just letting them go and letting them run, it's such a good example and resonates so well with me. And I'm sure so many people listening. One of the things too about years of experience is I feel like tech also has this like, oh, you haven't worked in tech, then your experience before doesn't matter. I feel like that has happened to me. It's also happened to people that I've seen in hiring cycles who have been IT managers or professional services, different types of companies for 10, 15 years, and they come into tech and it's like none of that experience actually ever mattered. And I think that tech is evolving away from that. I feel like that was more prevalent about 5 or 6 years ago, but it is a really good point. And I love that you talked about it being part of the contract, because hiring and interview feel like a one-way street and it's got to be two-way. And the idea of making sure that they are successful is important. And you mentioned the 3 R's, recruit, retain, and revenue. So I want to ask you about the second R, about retaining. When it comes to retaining, you've mentioned a lot about onboarding, getting them set up for success. Talk to me about why onboarding is so important to you, that it's come up in every theme that you've discussed today.
I'll go back to the kind of original kind of foundation around it. It establishes, I'll say, credibility around what you're going to do as a leader to make the people you bring on successful. It's also, just to kind of bring back the other point around inheriting a team, it's also your understanding. It's you're showing your team that you're willing to roll up your sleeves and do work. While it's not the day-to-day work that they end up having to do, it's the work that you're doing sort of behind the scenes when you're interacting with them. You're showing thoughtfulness, you're showing mindfulness, you're showing an appreciation of what is happening. You're also providing a perspective. And so why I think the onboarding thing is so important, especially from a when you talk about the second R around retaining, if you establish that trust, that credibility, and that baseline, it's much easier to understand where somebody wants or needs to go in their career. John Kerr talks about this all the time, right? Talks about, okay, pre-sales can be a jumping off point to a lot of different opportunities. Dominic Donato talked about it in his last podcast as well, right? Having this ability to do anything if you're in pre-sales, that can be important to somebody. And so having that onboarding, having things you need to do, and then also really wrapped around that culture of feedback allows you to have those conversations because you want to keep good talent. You want to keep good talent to do the things that are going to help your organization grow and scale. And oh, by the way, because you're allowing people to expand their field of view, the onboarding now also helps you bring in new talent. It helps you figure out, we're pivoting this particular part of our business. We had that pivot, I think, late last year when we started with like your traditional enterprise fields, SEs, and we started really thinking about this buyer-led movement, how people are coming into your product. They want to get more value before the paywall. And so one of the things we thought about is, okay, how do we improve that experience? And so what we decided is, okay, we need a pre-sales discipline in that particular part of our business without necessarily pulling in field SEs to have to be more, I'll say, transactional, for lack of a better word. So having the onboarding up front allowed me to pivot to figure out, okay, what are the other things that we have to think about or not think about? Allowed me to have a conversation with recruiting about skill sets. What do we pivot in terms of the skill sets, the experience level, and things of that nature? So I think all of those things are important. Again, to me, that onboarding piece is just super foundational to using that as a decision point in terms of when things change, how things change, because things don't stay the same. Teams don't stay in situ, right, for lack of a better word, in perpetuity. Things always morph and change, and you have to have the ability to morph and change as a leader.
I want to discuss more, Ricardo, on this effectiveness of these pre-sales teams. You've recruited individuals, you've onboarded them. Now, how do you make them successful? You just kind of mentioned this as leaders. Some of the best leaders really understand the multiplier benefit, how you can maximize the strengths of all your employees. Rob Johnson on a PreSales Qualitative podcast called it inspiring uniqueness. And I love that he said that. So I want to know from your perspective, how do you find that multiplier benefit within your team? How do you maximize the potential of the individuals once they're in your organization?
It's a great question, I think, from the component of your job is never done. And so I think one of the things that's super important to me, having been an SE, having been in pre-sales, and now, as a leader, you're continuing to build and lead teams, is I start with kind of the baseline. How well does somebody think through solving the problem? How well can somebody break a problem down into their constituent parts? How do they dig in and really understand and have that level of curiosity and really seek to understand? I think that it's a continuing and evolving skill that you have to practice, because it's very easy to get caught up in fires that are burning, right? And it's hard to really take a step back and really think about how to break problems down into those constituent parts. When I think about how I break up or how I think about work and work in the context of team, we're all focused on revenue. Revenue is so important, right? Revenue is the marker, is the metric for success. Again, talking about earlier, those qualitative pieces that build up to that outcome. How do you build those skills? How do you continue to work on things that get you to that point? And so there's a couple of different techniques and things that I've done, or then that I continue to do. One is when you have an opportunity for feedback or you sense something that needs to be addressed, you got to write it down. You got to write down all the details of what you're experiencing, how you're experiencing the moment. When you give that feedback, you can't wait. I learned from a great sales leader that I work with in my prior lifetime. And one of the things I attribute him is this concept of bad news is best heard right away. And so any sort of feedback that you end up giving that isn't super positive, you have to assume it's always going to be construed negatively. You want to be expedient. You want to be detailed. You want to be also mindful of what may be motivating. So seek to understand, and then also be specific on what activities need to happen if you need to remediate. One of the other things that I've learned from a book called Fierce Conversations is the responsibility model. It's root, trunk, branch, and leaf. And so root are the things that you do as a leader. Nobody touches that. That's your responsibility. Recruiting, onboarding, things of that nature. Those are all root responsibilities. Trunk are the things that we need collectively to do together as a team. And then your branch is your ability to basically take a task or set of tasks, have accountability around them. Okay, we're going to do these 3 things. We're going to report back on our next one-on-one how we did, what we learned, how we're going to move forward. And then leaf activities are things that you go and you do as part of your day-to-day. There's no accountability. You just run with those because I expect you to be able to execute those on a regular basis. The last thing I'll say in terms of some project-related activity, I'll say that things that aren't directly related to customer engagements that help you build that muscle and build that foundation. I've got a DevOps, Agile, Lean background. And so one of the things we try to do with our team meetings is I try to not make them readouts. I try to leverage asynchronous communications for company sort of things that I think are important. They need to follow up on. It's trust in the team that they'll basically take that and understand it and follow up on it. I try not to make the team meetings about that. I do try to make the team meetings more about work that needs to get done. And so we use a Kanban board to basically visualize all the work that we'll do. And we make that a collaborative exercise. So I'll put a theme out or something that I think we need to work on. People will kind of put in their tasks around what they think needs to get done. We'll all ideate and sort of figure out what they are. And then that board, essentially, the whole idea of Kanban is that you pull work off of a board. You don't push work onto someone. So the more you pull, the more I can sense that you're leaned in. So I can see that you have that aptitude and that willingness to want to be a part of things versus if you don't pull and we have to push, that becomes more of a challenge. The other nice thing about having that project-related work kind of laid out is that it's sort of like a self-motivator. The more one person pulls versus another person not pulling, there should be some level of competition that builds up without having to kind of talk about the fact that, hey, I need everyone to take 3 different tasks from this board. That never goes well. That's push. People don't respond to push. That's a hard thing to do, especially when you're just not in the room with anyone, being a remote first company. So having that type of visualization where we all feel like we're working together on something, I think is super valuable to help level up the team.
So well said there. I like the example of the root, trunk, branch, leaf component in terms of pre-sales. But one of the first things that you started talking about there was really problem solving and breaking down the problem and understanding it and getting to the root. And I think that's what this role really is at the end of the day. I always say it's a customer-centric problem solver, because if you're a problem solving, generally you might be solving for what's in the best interest of you or your company. But if you say customer-centric problem solver, you're putting the customer at the center of your problem solving. And so I like your example there and how you broke that down. So your examples around agile and pulling versus pushing really do have me thinking about culture within teams, especially nowadays in this remote first world. It's harder than ever to build culture and sometimes for people to lean into work because we have so many different distractions. We're in the same office, same place that we've been sitting for the last year and a half. And sometimes that can end up taking a toll on a team. And so in my career, for better or for worse, I do believe in addition by subtraction. There are plenty of quotes out there around a team is only as strong as the weakest player. What are your thoughts on working with an individual who may or may not be making the most of their opportunity and actually are bringing the team morale down and having a negative impact? How do you handle that as it relates to effective pre-sales teams?
So I think kind of going back to the original premise around having that sense of understanding of how the teams are operating, how they're willing to take on work and do the work that is customer centric, but isn't necessarily tied to a specific opportunity and engagement with the customer. And so again, just really understanding that, sensing that that's happening, being detailed around writing those things down, and then making it part of your one-on-ones. I mentioned earlier, like one of the things you should absolutely be doing when you first inherit a team is basically establishing your groundwork around collaboration and communication, and having those one-on-ones is absolutely critical. Again, especially in a remote world, we don't have the opportunity to just grab coffee with somebody or schedule FaceTime. So having that just already scheduled in on the books is really, really important. And I think making the one-on-ones clear about who it's for them. It's for your team. To your point about where people might be bringing other people down on the team, that's about them. Because something is motivating them, or is something at least either implicitly or subconsciously is driving that behavior. And so really seeking to understand what are all those things that are happening to help work with them to bring them up and understand what are the paths to understanding how to improve that morale. Is it a workload problem? Is it just a general lack of feeling plugged in? There's a lot of different things that can distill down. And as we know in pre-sales, your audience doesn't tell you what the problems are right away. You have to dig in and go 2 or 3 levels deep to understand. And it's really no different from a people leadership perspective. So really at the end of the day, it's having a clear understanding of what's happening, what the responsibility is on each one of you. There's a responsibility on you as the leader to have those conversations. It's also your responsibility for you as a leader to actually figure out what the best path forward is. And it's most critical for you as a leader to actually understand those motivations and bring those motivations forward so that you can have real conversations around what are the problems, for lack of a better way to put it, so that you can start figuring out. Because other than that, it really becomes a tug of war. It becomes a war of wills. And the one thing I try to continue to hold on to as a leader, and it's hard, it's a lot of introspection that I have to do a lot of the times. Going in and saying, well, I'm your manager or I'm your boss, it's going to be like this, just never works. You have to have a commitment around really pulling people in and getting them to understand that it's really important to share with you what it is that's potentially dragging them down, right? So you can work together to help bring that back up.
I love that you talked about seeking to understand, because there could be so many different reasons. It could be something happening at home in the personal lives. It could be what they're doing in their day-to-day. Maybe this role isn't a best fit for them, but being at the company is. Maybe it's their sales partnerships that they're working with or their sales leader. Seeking to understand the root cause and then making an adjustment and setting these people up for success. I think sometimes leaders will try to move somebody out too quickly without totally understanding the root problem. But there's also the flip side where we hang on too long trying to solve the problem. So seeking to understand what's going on, making the adjustments, finding out how we make that person successful, whether it's in our team or not, whether it's in our company or not, and then actioning on that. I think that's a really important component of effective teams. Where should somebody start when they want to understand the components of creating an effective pre-sales team for their organization?
So I think it comes down to really 3 things. I know we talked about a lot of different tactics and approaches, but I really think it comes down to 3 things. So if you haven't done so, make building an onboarding plan one of your priorities. It's critical when you're building out the pre-sales function. It's actually just as critical when you're inheriting a team. Your priorities may be different, so it may not be the thing you have to do right away, but really building an onboarding plan, understanding all the different activities, how you're going to engage and collaborate, how that person is going to go from, 0 to enabled is super important. And having that solid foundation just clearly outlines what needs to be done. It brings home the second point around establishing that culture of feedback. It's so crucial, especially now with remote first cultures. Communicating what feedback actually means, how it will happen, and at the crux of it, that it's 2-way is really important. And so again, that just priority just shifts where you are, where you may be coming in, but those 2 things are super important. And then on that note about communication, communicate what you're doing with your stakeholders. We talked about recruiting being a stakeholder, sales as a stakeholder, customer success as a stakeholder, product is a critical stakeholder of all of this. And so giving those stakeholders the understanding and the confidence that you are actually doing the things that you're talking about, walking the walk, so to speak, is really, really important. We all know, being a member of the PreSales Collective, how valuable we are to a technology company's success. And so this is your opportunity to really seize how you talk about or how you elevate pre-sales within your organization. You're actually showing everyone what it takes to actually be effective at pre-sales. You're distilling down the parts outside of hire unicorns, hire A players, hire rock stars. Those are very nebulous and just they're great to talk about, but they're not anything that's going to actually move the needle. And you need to own this as a leader. No one else is going to do this for you. Seize the opportunity when you have it really early on to be able to and continue to communicate with stakeholders around these sort of things that are happening. Frankly, pre-sales, we talk about it all the time on the PreSales Collective. Measuring the effectiveness of pre-sales is so important. There's so many things that build up to that measurement of success that if you're not talking about those things, if you're not communicating those things, if you're not being open and transparent about what those things are, you tend to get left to be buried under those numbers, and people don't really understand or appreciate what it means to elevate pre-sales.
Ricardo, love the answer. I really appreciate you joining me on the PreSales Podcast today. Thanks for your time today. And really thanks for everything that you're doing for the New York local chapter. Love to see the group coming together. Love to see the continual progress. So thanks again for everything.
Thank you, James. I appreciate the opportunity and really look forward to continue to lean in with all you in terms of growing pre-sales here in New York and across the PreSales Collective. Thank you so much.
See you next time. All right, PreSales Collective, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I've had the privilege to really spending a lot of time with Ricardo over the last few months with our in-person event and the podcast and some planning that we're doing. So love hearing his perspective. I really enjoyed how he broke down the components of constructing an effective pre-sales team and how I look at this as the idea of recruiting, retaining, and revenue. And what are we doing in those three buckets? Ricardo put a strong emphasis on onboarding and then really creating a culture of feedback and measuring your team and their success. And I love his example of maximizing his employees through his previous experience utilizing agile methodologies and using Kanban boards to allow for project work to kind of be that pull mechanism so that people who want to lean in can lean in. And again, we've talked about it many times before. How do you maximize your employees? As I alluded to what Rob Johnson said previously, how do you inspire uniqueness and get the best out of your employees? And Ricardo dove into a lot of specifics around the job role and hiring and how you even work with your recruiting partners to make sure that your job description is inclusive, the way it's being sold to the market is effective and really brings out who you are and your team to life through that. One of the things that Ricardo mentioned that has really resonated with me is this idea of when it comes to hiring, you're part of the contract. Making sure that when someone joins your company and joins your team, they can be successful. And what are you committing to them to make that leap and make that jump to your organization so that you can build that effective pre-sales team or that pre-sales organization? I'm going to go back to the concept of creating that culture of feedback. He said, bad news best heard right away. And really diving into that and making sure that people feel comfortable sharing their opinions, sharing what's working, what's not working. That is a critical component of organizational behavior and organizational makeup to maximize the potential and growth in your employees. All right, PreSales Collective, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. As always, please like and share the podcast. If you think that this episode would resonate with somebody, please send it to them. I would appreciate it. As always, I'll see you next week.